G'day, Troy here from RoadSafe. So today we're fitting some of our Black Hawk upper control arms to this MR Triton. MQ and MR and Pajero Sport are all the same upper control arm. And what these arms do is provide additional clearance and wheel alignment function. As you can see in the original arm, the factory strut gets very close to the upper control arm in a factory environment. So when we go and put aftermarket suspension with aftermarket larger body struts, the clearance here gets very, very tight, and the factory upper control arm actually contacts almost any aftermarket strut. When doing wheel alignment, we need to adjust by the lower eccentrics and the lower control arm, and this sweeps the strut backwards and forwards as the strut's mounted to the lower control arm. So as we move the lower control arm, the strut can move forward to gain more caster. The challenge is the factory upper control arm is in the way, so you can't have those two suspension parts contacting each other. With the Black Hawk upper control arm, we've changed the profile of the arm to provide as much clearance and also pressed clearance for aftermarket larger coils to have plenty of clearance there. We've also moved the ball joint to provide more caster and changed the arm dimensions to correct camber on lifted vehicles. All of this working together in symmetry provides solutions for a lot of the problems that we find in the front of these raised suspension IFS vehicles. With raised suspension, especially in these Triton vehicles, they don't lend themselves to correcting the wheel alignment, especially a performance wheel alignment for raised vehicles, and that's a bit more camber, a bit more caster to give better control and handling. So that's why we look to use an aftermarket arm. Not only for those reasons, the clearancing, you cannot have the factory suspension strut or an aftermarket strut touching a steering component such as an upper control arm. In a day-to-day environment with lifted suspension and the factory components, you might be able to achieve a factory specification wheel alignment, but it'll be at the very low core end of the alignment settings that you want to be able to achieve. And that means you might get increased tyre wear, uneven tyre wear, poor handling. So when we fit the Black Hawk upper control arms, we can get a much better wheel alignment, getting back up into the positive end of wheel alignment settings, giving good caster camber, good toe adjustment, which means we negate all that tyre wear issue. We get all that handling and a good confident handling back into the vehicle. When we start looking at that in an off-road environment, there's a number of key things. So the main thing being on these vehicles, they run a droop stop, and that limits the upper control arm coming down to protect all the suspension components. So the Black Hawk arms have been developed and engineered to be street legal in Australia. So to do that, it means we need to incorporate all the brake lines, so the ABS line, so we include on this design fir tree clips, plug into here and the ABS line gets rerouted as per factory, providing plenty of clearance for aftermarket and off-road suspension. So with the Black Hawk upper control arms being ADR compliant, it means we meet and exceed all the OE, so Mitsubishi specs on the factory upper control arm. So we replicate the droop stop mount, brake line, ABS line mounts, and we allow for all that to still work as per what Mitsubishi did at the very start. Another feature we've done with the Black Hawk upper control arms is provided a drain hole in the ball joint cup now. So if you do get any condensation or water ingress under the rubber lipped cap into the housing, that will drain out the back now. With the Black Hawk upper control arms, they all run an aftermarket designed by RoadSafe heavy duty greasable ball joint. It's imperative, which is why we put a little tag on every product now, that they get greased at install to ensure that the metal on metal components inside are lubricated and have a long lasting life. So with the RoadSafe four-wheel drive heavy-duty ball joints fitted to all the Black Hawk upper control arms, they are manufactured as a greasable component, so they can be serviced, and they must be greased at install. So they only come from the factory with assembly grease, which is not enough to lubricate it in the service life. How to know when you've greased enough is essentially by watching the boot. So normally 3 to 4 good pumps from the grease gun. When grease comes through the joint and you can see the boot just start to move a little bit, that is enough grease. Grease has entered the boot, which means the ball joint is full. Now you don't want the boot to move and bellow with grease, because that is called over-greasing, and you'll actually pull the boot off when the vehicle starts driving and articulating. So on this vehicle with the Black Hawk upper control arm, the droop stop used in the factory OE control arm is severely compromised in the factory setup, let alone when we add aftermarket suspension. Quite often, fitters and installers of aftermarket suspension need to cut that droop stop in half just to get enough room to get the factory arm back in. So Black Hawk have reprofiled our arm, and with the mount we run a shim. So the shim can be mounted to the arm, and then the factory full-size droop stop can be refitted to the Black Hawk arm, meaning you get all of the workable droop stop, or you can remove the shim and gain additional droop with aftermarket suspension. If doing that, you need to look at strut length, tie rod length, angles, and everything else in the suspension system to make sure it's all working in conjunction with each other. So at RoadSafe, we'll never tell you that you have to do something. Everyone gets the option and can form their own opinion. On the MQ, MR, Triton and Pajero Sport, there's a couple of key elements when fitting aftermarket raised suspension that you just cannot ignore, and that is wheel alignment and the contact between the strut and the upper control arm. That is a serious issue and does need to be rectified. The only way that you can rectify that is with an aftermarket upper control arm. If you choose not to and you run the factory upper control arm, you will not get a good wheel alignment setting. You might be able to get it in the bottom end of the green wheel alignment settings, but you will suffer from tyre wear and poor handling unless you fit an aftermarket product to correct all that.